This will just be moving wallpaper. I did a little crowdsourcing on Facebook the other day, asking people about films where women were watching films. There are actually a lot of them. I didn't have enough time to find all of the films, so I was also going by what's available on the internet. But I promise you, this is the start of a new project, because I'd really love to make a video essay about this, and then I have to think if I'm going to focus on the close-up, because there's so many beautiful close-ups, and in those cases you don't know what people are watching, but you will also see that there's some stills where we can actually see the screen. So this is, I don't hope it's too distracting, so you will also look a little bit at me, not because I'm so nice to look at, but that's encouraging better listening. But this is what I want to tell, because as a film critic, I always go by the images. So thank you, Koen, for inviting me. And yes, indeed, it's really nice to be back here. And also, even if I hadn't been invited to talk, this morning alone was inspiring and intriguing enough to make it worth my time. That's also why I decided to make a few changes in what I was going to say, because I felt like actually what I'm going to talk about, which will be a very personal talk, it's sort of going through my career, so to speak, speaking of three themes. One is culture shocks, the other is back to suffragette city, and then the last one will be typecasting. But actually some of the stuff that was addressed this morning, I'd like to recap in my own words or address, because I think it also plays a part in what I have to say, or the moment where my thinking is. The fact that I'm giving a personal talk is because I'm a film critic, I'm a journalist mostly. I do some other stuff as well. So I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, so I don't have stats and numbers to go back to. So I have my own impressions, being a critic for over 25 years, which is actually something that I got more and more interested in. So the subtitle of the talk has become anecdotal evidence, because I think critics deal a lot with anecdotal evidence, and that's probably also one of the shifts that I've been noticing in the last 25 years, that from a more objective or objectified way to look at cinema and also at your own position as a critic, there has become some kind of a tendency towards more personal writing has become more prevalent, and at the same time it's still some kind of objectified way. It's not gonzo journalism. So how do we deal with anecdotal evidence? How do we study ourselves? Is something that I got more and more interested in, and it's also going to be one of my pet projects. So we have the anecdotal evidence and the women watching film. I mean, there's so much going on. Anyway, but before I'm really going to start, I actually also want to break the hierarchy with the audience, because it's not so often that as a critic you actually get to see the faces of, well, your potential readers or cinema goers or people that are reading reviews. That's also one of the reasons that I really like to do live introductions, which I always try to understand as a form of live film criticism. So who are you in the audience? And I know if I'm going to ask everyone, then the half hour will be over. But I mean, maybe I can ask, are there critics in the audience? So there are some critics and programmers, some programmers, teachers, people, well, academics are probably also there, but also people from other fields of art, mediation, so to speak. Okay, and is there someone in the audience that says, oh, but I have a totally different background or profession that's also interesting to know, like I'm a farmer? I don't know. Yes, please? Okay, no, because that's good. And also, I have to talk fast, because I already wanted to have some time to talk to you before we talk, but I have to go back to some of the things that Judith and Ian addressed. One is something that Ian was talking about, of course, is the gender stereotyping and the gendered taste, and this idea that women prefer mediocre blockbusters, even though the emergence of gaze theories in the 70s maybe brought on a new appreciation of certain types that were traditionally seen as female, and that there was another understanding of that. Because when I hear something like that, and when I see these the results of the research, and this is, no offense, Ian, it's not personally, but when I see that on the screen, I get intrigued, because I feel like, oh, maybe I'm not the right person to represent women in the cinema, because actually I really do like action movies and sci-fi and hardcore art film. And then we talk about cinephilia, which traditionally also has been seen very much as a kind of a male, I don't know, conspiracy almost. So this is where I'm conflicted, because there is obviously something that is happening in an audience or in certain audiences. As a philosopher, I'm also interested in maybe the underlying reasons for that, more like the sociology or the anthropology behind it. But it's something that I noticed, and that I was getting itchy. Like, okay, there's these gendered preferences, and how do I relate to that as a critic, and how do I relate to that also in my writing when I address myself to audiences, and who is that audience? Also, because Ian noticed that the male and female critic might differ in their opinions on certain films. And this is something that you can really notice when you look at, for instance, what is called film Twitter, and when a new superhero movie is coming out, there is a vile sexism going on as soon as a female critic writes about a superhero movie, whether it be positive or negative, but she never fully understood the impact of what was going on in that superhero movie. And that's really something that, when that happens on film Twitter, I think the worst parts of human nature emerge. So there is something there. And you see it at other moments as well, and especially nowadays when female film critics try to champion certain films that have, say, more female topics or female protagonists, or they are usually also typecasted, and typecasting is something I also hope to talk about, as the ones that are writing about female filmmakers, essentially. So there's definitely something there. Do I like Love Actually more than Wolf of Wall Street? I am not so sure. Do I have problems with Wolf of Wall Street? Yes, because it's a very misogynist film. So is there a reason why male critics prefer that film? I don't know, but for me, just the realization of this is already super interesting. Then something else that Ian also talked about is, of course, the article that Manola Dargis wrote about being a female critic in the post Me Too era, and I think this is really something that all female critics have been influenced by, because we already always saw the sexism, but in a way we internalized it to an extent that we felt it was normal, it was the default mode, and we were the exceptions, or we were the freaks. So better not to address it. And those kind of movements like Me Too and Time's Up really changed the possibility for us to speak out about it. And it's not us as female critics, but I think it goes for a lot of underrepresented voices in criticism and in the public debate in general. That is also something that's really important to understand. Like, there were always women in the industry and in the cinemas, but why weren't they seen? Or why were these opinions always there, but why weren't they heard? Or why weren't they expressed more firmly? This is also what I really liked about Judith's talk, because I'm actually going to address you directly with a question, because we're both from the Netherlands, and you already mentioned that you did a lot of research on female audiences in the Netherlands, which I think when it comes to art cinema and auteur cinema, actually female audiences are the biggest audiences going to that, especially when it's not like the hardcore festival art cinema, but it's kind of the sub-level art films. So that's interesting, because that is sort of counter an international trend, I think, where this is more male-oriented. But we have a very special situation in the Netherlands as well, especially between 2000 and 2010, that we had an equality in male and female critics. Now it has changed again. I'm not going to ask this to you as a scholar, because I know you can't philosophize and do like wild statements, but do you think that the situation in the Netherlands is slightly different because we have more female voices in newspapers and magazines?
I think you're right. It may well be, yes. I mean, I would find it pretty convincing to think it like that. I would like to
do research.
Like well, I was actually thinking maybe I have to talk to you and put some of my graduate students on some of these questions.
No. Okay, this is what also happens at those conferences, is that people make plans for future research. Okay, because this is also something that I find interesting. When there is some kind of a balance, maybe the ideas that are being articulated in criticism also find more resonance by both male and female audiences. But it has changed, and it has changed due to the economical crisis, where somehow the staff writers once again were all male. Okay. Actually, this could also be a very nice talk, but I still have to tell you some things from my own experience, and I really hope that we can talk about it. Because being a film critic for 25 years in the Netherlands, in Western Europe, of course, is a particular perspective. I've been a mentor for many talent press projects, for instance, at Sarajevo Film Festival, so I'm a bit more familiar also with the situation, say, on the Balkans and beyond. I know virtually nothing about criticism in Asia or the Far East. I know a little bit about the situation in Latin America, which is still very male-oriented. For instance, at the Berlinale, there's also a talent press project, and although this group is usually gender balanced, the amount of women that proceed to have a career is significantly less than the male critics that turn on. But still, I mean, I have a lot of blind spots, so I'm also speaking very much from my own perspective, and I'm going to question it. When I started as a critic in the late 90s, that was the time that Adrian Martin and Jonathan Rosenbaum had just published their book Movie Mutations, where they established a new way of thinking about cinephilia, and there was one woman in that book, which was the French writer and scholar Nicole Brenet. And then a second version came out, and then all around the world, kind of local initiatives initiated those kind of letters between critics, and more women were writing about the subject. But the initial book was basically just a boys' club talking about the films they liked. Sorry, I can say this, right? Or not? I mean, also, if anyone in the audience is offended, you can come to me. I can just, I don't know. I can deal with that. Anyway, when Movie Mutations came out, Nick James, the former editor-in-chief of Sight and Sound, said that at that time, when this, end of the 90s, when the kind of the follow-up movie Mutations came out, he said, yeah, there's more female film critics now because actually they're more empathetic, so they understand cinema better. And for me, starting as a critic at that time, I didn't necessarily think empathy was the thing or the quality that I needed to be a good critic. I'd rather do something about film history and had some analytical skills and so on and so on. But it has been haunting me. Are female critics maybe more empathetic or not? And maybe actually, is that an asset? So another thought that I'm just gonna dump on you. Which brings me to the culture shocks, which was the name of a conference the Dutch Circle of Film Critics organized around 2000 at the International Film Festival Rotterdam, where a lot of Asian films at that time were being showcased. And we, as Dutch critics, realized that actually we may not understand those films completely. There was this one famous moment where a critic couldn't understand the difference between Cantonese and Mandarin Chinese, so he basically missed a lot of what was going on in the plot. Later on, also in the translation or in the subtitles, those were getting different colors, so that you were, at least as a non-Chinese speaker, were able to understand that people were speaking different languages. So we were talking about how to deal with the idea that maybe you're an outsider to a certain culture, and how can you write about it? Do you still apply the same objectified criteria that either exist or that you just learned from your mentors and teachers and predecessors? And to what extent could misunderstanding also be a form of understanding? So to what extent could actually addressing specifically that you didn't understand a certain culture, even after doing some research, could lead to an understanding of that particular film from your perspective, of course, of the world, could lead to a dialogue, but also on a deeper or higher level could lead to an understanding of what cinema is, because maybe there's still something that communicates that is universal. Soon after, this whole idea of universal approaches became really problematic, but it's once again one of those notions that is still with me, maybe also because of my philosophy background. Still, I believe there's a higher truth and stuff like that, because otherwise, why would we long so much for it, even if it's just a concept in this world? So why would we try to say the right things about a film if everything is subjective? How can we communicate if there's no shared or common language? So even if it doesn't exist as a concept, it's still very useful. From these ideas of the culture shocks, the idea of misunderstanding, soon thereafter I was asked to write a chapter for a book where female philosophers were writing about the subject, or the title that was She Thinks. And I said, well, I'd love to be in this group of eminent writers, but actually what I'm doing is, yes, maybe thinking, but what I'm mostly doing is watching or looking, which is the same word in Dutch. So, okay, I was allowed to cross the title as the title of the chapter, and it was She Looks. Then, of course, I had to understand, and that was the first time that I got really deeply involved in film theory, what is the concept of looking in film theory. And this is where immediately I was catapulted into Laura Mulvey, into the gaze theories of the 70s, and it really blew my mind, because one of my mentors, when I said to him, like, why are there so many male protagonists, and shouldn't we also maybe write different about the female characters in the film and give them a little bit more space or a little bit more agency? He just said no, but there's just more male directors and more male protagonists. Deal with it. So once again, internalizing this idea, okay, this is the way it is. For some reason I like cinema, so I deal with it and I write about it. And then reading Laura Mulvey, I mean, understanding that this was a particular way of looking at female characters through a male gaze, through a usually also a male director's eye, and then shortly thereafter, of course, discovering Chantal Akerman's work, which was at that time not so present in Dutch cinemas, I felt like, okay, I can re-emerge as a feminist, because I always felt myself a feminist because of working moms and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, but now I felt, no, it's not just like some kind of fact of life to be a feminist. No, I have to speak out. So that really, after being a film critic for quite some time, it really opened my eyes and it made me aware of a certain responsibility. And this touches on today's theme or today's subject, where we're talking about audiences and how to reach audiences and how to address them. And the critic, as a mediator or an intermediate, has a vital role in that. But what is your responsibility? Do I address female audiences differently than male audiences? Do I actually go back to these gender stereotypes when the present day Love Actually comes out? Do I say, oh, this is a nice film that will be liked by female audiences mostly? You hear, that's what they do in Variety. Actually, I don't necessarily do that, but when I was editing the film magazine in the Netherlands, I was keeping it into account. So if I knew that those films were coming out, and they may not be necessarily the films that the editorial team liked, I always said, yes, but this is a majority of the audiences going to the art house cinemas, so we have to take these films seriously. Even if it's just going to be like 3-star reviews, we have to maybe find other ways to write about it, to understand for ourselves and for our audiences what the appeal might be of those films. Also, to do something that I still strongly believe in, that as a critic you don't communicate with your readership or your audiences primarily, but also with the film, with film history, with the film directors. I don't know. It's a dialogue, and it changed my perspective of where I stood in that dialogue. You could say that was also the time where I was trying to understand, okay, if I am speaking, who am I? What is this I? I need to have some awareness of my own position, which I then called the politics of the critic, like in a reference to the auteur politics of the French New Wave. This sort of coincided with a major shift in journalism when, due to the internet, articles became more personal. So actually the I, first person, not the I, came back into writing, and it was once again allowed to speak from your own voice, maybe still a little bit an objectified voice, in order to make clear that it was someone speaking and it was not the newspaper expressing an opinion. This, of course, happened because of all the blogs and internet happened, but it was a really important shift in journalism. So when I was writing this chapter or this article for this book, I concluded with David Bowie's famous lines from his song "Back to Suffragette City," saying, "Okay, from now on, I'm taking a stand as a critic, and that might be a feminist stand, that might be a philosopher's stand, that might be some other stand, because I'm interested in many subjects. But at least my readers need to know, there need to be some kind of transparency, what point of view I'm speaking from, and that can still be a shifting perspective. But there was much more of a dialogue. This brings me to the third subject, which is typecasting, which is kind of a continuous process in all of my career, because when I started, I was young, so what do you get? You get the children's films and the weepies. So I was already, as a young woman, typecasted to write about the women's genres, and especially the ones that were also addressing women as mothers, because that's where you start with the children's films. Of course, once again, internalized, just happy to write about whatever I could get. And since I had this firm interest also in avant-garde cinema, it was nicely balanced. So I was the girl doing the children's movies and the movies that nobody understood. So that's kind of a funny profile. Actually, say in the middle part of my career, it got better when when the eye perspective was allowed into journalism, and when, as I just said, there was kind of a balance in male and female voices in the Netherlands, I could finally also write about science fiction and action movies that I really, really deeply like, because I'm also a big fan of the German film theory, Siegfried Kracauer, because I firmly believe that those kind of films, and even more so than superhero films and horror films that are traditionally perceived to be more transgressive, tell us something about our times. So when you write about action movies, or even better, like all these war movies, then you can really be a feminist, because there are so many hidden preconceptions in those kind of films about stereotype, gender roles, and you can address them. And you can also be a little bit ironic about it, but you can just nail it. So this is also, or was at that time also for me, a way to address the audience, saying, okay, you're just going to see this as entertainment, but it's not value-free. It's definitely something that is also giving you a lot of kind of hidden preconceptions that you might better be aware of. And at the same time, I also started to write more critical about romantic comedies, because of course they have the same kind of hidden stereotypes as well. So that all changed a little bit in this middle part, and then the second crisis or economical crisis happened, and nowadays you can see that a lot of the female writers that really flourished between 2000 and 2010 have moved into other directions. And in the Dutch newspapers, all the staff writers are male. There's literally no exception. All the women are freelancers. So this is another thing, like, okay, then we write about what we can write about, and then we also internalize, I don't know, the laws of the newspaper, and we just deal with it once again. But this sort of second moment of stereotyping happened when other really important discussions came up. I already mentioned Me Too and Time's Up, but it's also like the representation discussion happened again, because that already started a bit earlier, actually, than Me Too. And identity discussions leading into identity politics also happened again. So all of a sudden, another kind of typecasting began, which I'm even more conflicted about, because now you're specifically supposed to write from a female perspective about a film that addresses female issues. And now it's not just because you might kind of be more empathetic, no, because you have an expert voice on this. But what is my expert voice as a science fiction, action movie, hardcore avant-garde lover actually about romantic comedies, aside from the fact that I really know how to cry in a cinema? I hope this has given you some food for thought that we can talk about. Thank you.